Welcome to the Hidden Corners. Tonight we are going to be reading a story sent in by one of our listeners. I want to give a big thank you to those of you that have sent us stories, and if you'd like us to read your story, you can email it to thehiddencorners.story@gmail.com. Our story tonight is CLACK by Judy Snyder, who is the author of Twisted Tales. Her books are available on Amazon, and I'll put the link in the description so you can check it out. I want to thank Judy for sending this in to us, and I hope you'll enjoy her story. The story is called CLACK by Judy Snyder. After Lenny went away, Mom and Dad fought a lot. A lot. That was because his dad always told his mother she babied him too much. "Do you think you're going to keep him a little boy tied to your apron strings forever?" he would say. And then she would say, "But it's true, Charles Finley. Why can't you see that Paul is still just a little guy?" And then she'd cry, hidden in the bathroom. But Paul knew. It made him feel like he'd done something wrong, but he couldn't quite understand what. Paul stood next to his bed in his brand new birthday Spider-Man pajamas, and he was getting really tired of saying, "Yes, Dad, I understand, Dad." He must have said that a million gazillion times already. It had been his birthday. There had been strawberry cake and vanilla ice cream and presents. Grandma and Grandpa had even sent him one of those Polaroid Instamatics with film. It was so cool. You took a picture and it pushed out this gray-looking square, but after you shook it around a bit, the picture appeared like magic. But to Dad, it seemed that his 8th birthday only meant that he was too old for a lot of things now. Things like having a nightlight, or running in to climb in their bed when he'd had a bad dream or got scared. The boy continued to say yes to everything his father told him, even though he felt like he didn't really agree with him, and he most definitely didn't understand. He'd only started running to their room after Lenny had left. Before that, he'd just climb into bed with his brother. Lenny was older and braver. He'd protect him from any old monster. But Lenny was gone now. "Big boys of 8 want to be more grown up. They don't run away from their fears," his father had explained. "They face them, and you must face yours too so that you can be big and grown up." His dad said they would leave his bedroom door open for him with the hall light on. That would take care of the darkness. Anyway, he was too old to believe in such nonsense as monsters under the bed or in his closet, wasn't he? And he had better not be calling out for Dad to come check, because if he did, Dad would be very disappointed in him. And he didn't want that, did he? Paul shook his head no. Dad had been disappointed in Lenny, and Lenny had gone away. Paul remembered that clearly. Charles had been squatted down in front of Paul, a heavy hand on his shoulder. Now and then he'd squeeze that shoulder just a bit too hard to be sure he had the boy's attention. "You do understand, don't you?" His thumb dug into the soft flesh, just enough to make the boy wince, and Paul nodded, "Yes, sir." The heavy hand relaxed as his father said, "Good. Now go to bed." With that, his father turned off the light and left the room. Paul laid there for a few minutes wondering if his mom would come to tuck him in, or if he was now too old for that, too. At least the room wasn't completely dark, just shadowy. Paul looked at the closet door that was sitting slightly open. Quickly he slid out of bed and ran over to shut it, pulling the chair up against it. There! That should keep any closet monster from coming into his room. He had barely made it back into his bed when Mom came in. She sat on his bed, and together they looked at the pictures taken with his new camera. "I like this one of you." She pointed at the one of him with his cake. "I can't believe how much you look like Lenny." He agreed that it was pretty good. She kissed him good night and wished him happy birthday once more as she turned back off his light. He waited a few minutes after his mother left, and leaning over the side of the bed, pulled out an old cookie tin. It had been his and Lenny's treasure box. He sat on his bed, with his legs folded Indian chief style, and carefully opened the box. At the top of the box was his trusty Halloween flashlight with the jack-o'-lantern face. He pointed the narrow beam onto his secret picture of Lenny. He stared at the picture. Lenny was 8 in the picture, in real life. Paul had just turned 8. He thought he and Lenny looked just alike. He twisted a bit and got the picture taken just that day and laid them next to each other. Yep, same almost black hair and the same eyes that the grown-ups called Hazel, just like Lenny's. Paul nodded. If only 8-year-old Lenny was standing next to him, everyone would say they were twins. Mom had cried a lot after Lenny left, so much so that when Grandma and Grandpa came for Lenny's funeral, they took her and Paul back to their house for a couple of weeks. Dad said he couldn't take that kind of time off work, but he thought it was a good idea for them to go. And when they came back, everything that was Lenny's, or reminded them of him, was simply gone. All his pictures had been taken down, all his clothes were gone from the closet, even his bed had been moved out. Paul remembered finding the picture of Lenny behind the trash cans one day. He looked down, and there it was. He would have told, but Dad had said he should never talk about Lenny or even say his name anymore. It would just make Mom sad. So instead of sharing his find, he brought it up to his room, the room he once had shared with Lenny, and hid it in the treasure box. It was like Dad had made everything disappear so that they could forget that Paul had ever had a big brother, one who looked like him, and who was 2 years older than he was. But Paul didn't ever want to forget that he had once had the best big brother ever, and he never forgot what happened that day either. He was to blame for part of it. He was the reason Lenny had gotten into a fight with Teddy Williams. Teddy Williams was pretty much the school bully. He was in 5th grade and considered himself boss of the school, just like his dad was boss at the factory, where Lenny's and his dad and nearly everyone else's parents worked. Teddy used that. Being the boss's son had its perks, and when Paul refused to give Teddy his lunch, Teddy had threatened to punch him. Teddy had his fist raised when Lenny tackled him. Dad had never asked why Lenny had gotten into the fight, but seemed more concerned over who it was with. And he told Mr. Williams he was sorry for his boy's actions, that he was disappointed in Lenny for not trying to solve things with his words like an adult. Dad had his hand on Lenny's shoulder, gripping it tightly, telling him to say he was sorry. Then Lenny said, right in front of that mean 5th grader, and the boy's dad, too, that Teddy was nothing but a big bully, and he got what he had coming, and he was not sorry, and he wasn't going to say that he was, because it wasn't true. And if he ever picked on Paul again, he'd hit him again. With that, Lenny jerked away from Dad's grip and ran outside. Paul heard a screech of tires on pavement, along with the blast of a car's horn, and then everyone was running outside. After that, Lenny never came back, and Mom cried every day for a long time. Paul cried too. Sometimes Paul wondered, what if Dad hadn't been disappointed in Lenny? What if Lenny hadn't talked back and said, sorry, even if he didn't mean it? Would Lenny still be here? Yes, he wondered about that, and he was a little afraid to say the wrong thing to Dad. But most of the time, he just missed Lenny. Click, clack, click, clack. Paul stiffened. Click, clack, click, clack. He knew that sound. He hadn't heard it in a long time. It was right outside. Paul climbed out of his bed, went to the window, and pulling back the curtain, looked down into the yard below. The moon was full, and it was easier to see outside of his room than it was inside of it. What? Can't be. No, I'm not asleep. This isn't a dream. It's really real. He rubbed his eyes and stared again. Click, clack, click, clack. Paul leaned forward until his nose pressed against the glass. He breathed out his brother's name. Lenny was right there, in the bright moonlight, out in the backyard, playing with a clacker. The noise the balls would make when they swung upwards was a click. When they fell, they clacked as they hit one another. That sound had driven their dad bonkers. Lenny could click and clack for a long time before the balls would miss each other and fall down in silence. Lenny had loved his clacker so much that Mom put it with him in the graveyard box before they closed it and put it in the ground. Paul didn't waste another moment. He slipped out his bedroom door, hurried down the stairs, and then went ever so quietly out the back door to join his brother. Lenny, I'm so happy to see you. I guess grown-ups aren't so smart, are they? They said I'd never see you again. Shh, keep it down, will ya? We don't want Dad coming down and spoiling our fun, do we? Paul shook his head hard and whispered, Is it a secret that you're here? Yes, don't tell anyone, or I'll have to go away again, this time for keeps. Understand? I understand. I won't tell anybody. Swear? Paul nodded and drew a big X over his heart. Lenny smiled. Come on, Goofus, let's play. And they raced to the treehouse and climbed up to where no one could see them. They laughed and traded shoulder punches and told jokes like, What streets do ghosts haunt? Dead ends. And, What do you call a fly with no wings? A walk. I've missed you so, so much, Lenny. I've missed you too, Squirt. There was a slight pause before he continued. It wasn't your fault, you know. Paul sat on the floor of the treehouse, looking at his big brother in the dim moonlight that filtered in. Lenny always seemed to know what he was thinking, almost before he knew himself. It wasn't? Heck no! That Teddy Williams crossed a line bullying a first grader. That's right up there with hitting a girl. You just don't pick on kids a lot littler than you. Everybody knows that. What was I supposed to do? Tell that jerk not to pound you? Bullies don't ever listen to words, no matter how grown up the words sound. He laid a cold hand on Paul's shoulder. If it hadn't been you, it would have been some other little kid. Lenny's voice broke and his face clouded over. Dad said he was disappointed in me, but he's the one who let me down. What kind of big brother wouldn't stand up and stop that kind of crap? What kind of dad doesn't stand up for his kid when they do the right thing? Then telling me to say I was sorry. That's just bullshit. It made me so angry, he may as well have shoved me in front of that car. Paul's mouth fell open. You said a swear. You said 2 swears. Lenny shrugged. It's just us here. We can swear if we want. Isn't that what grown-ups do? And Dad is always on us to act grown up. Guess so, but Mom sure wouldn't like it. A little while later, Lenny told Paul it was time for him to go back in so he wouldn't get caught, and above all else, he was to always remember not to tell anyone that his brother came back. Paul sat, clutching his old stuffed dog to his chest, in the space between his bed and nightstand. He didn't like all the thunder and lightning, or that the power kept threatening to go out. He had been downstairs watching All in the Family on TV with Mom and Dad. When the storm started getting bad, he had moved closer to Mom. He couldn't help jumping, just a little, when the thunder clapped. But he didn't mean to gasp, just a little, when the lightning would light up the room or the lights flicker. But then Dad had sent him to his room, saying he didn't want to look at someone being such a baby over a little rain and noise. Mom tried to get Dad to let him stay, but as usual, what Dad said goes. So here he was. At least he had Rags. Rags had been Lenny's first, and when Lenny had turned 8, he had given him to Paul. Hugging Rags helped Paul to feel a little better. He didn't care if he was supposed to be too old for an old stuffed toy. Dad sure would have given him a what for if he had found out, though. He knew the only reason he still had Rags and the treasure box is that he had taken them with him when he and Mom had gone to Grandma's house, and he had kept them out of sight since. Paul remembered what Lenny had said. Be careful, Paul. I'm warning you. If he ever finds Rags, you'll be in big trouble. I know. And if he gets real mad, he might try to hurt you like he did me. Do you really think he meant for that to happen to you? Everybody said it was an accident. Think about it, Paul. He doesn't want you to be a kid, does he? And when a person isn't a kid anymore, they go away and live somewhere else. That's the way it is in real life. But that takes a lot of years, and that makes me think Dad doesn't like little kids. He got rid of me first chance he got, and now that just leaves you, the only little kid left. Paul did think about it. What about all those times his father had told him he was too old for something he loved? And what about all those times he yelled at Mom for being nice and told her she was babying him? And what about what happened with Lenny? On TV, the dad would have said something like, "Look, I'm sorry my boy gave yours a black eye instead of talking things out, but I can't help but be a little proud, too. Standing up to someone 2 years older and much bigger to defend your little brother, that's pretty brave." But Dad wasn't like a TV dad. He wasn't even like most of the other neighborhood dads. All the other boys would talk about playing catch or going fishing with their dads or building stuff. Dad always said he was too tired or too busy to be bothered. About the only time he wanted to do something with them was at company picnics or somewhere folks were around, like it was just for show. Paul frowned. He had never really thought about that before, maybe because up until 2 years ago he had had Lenny, and they always did things together. The more he thought about what Lenny had said, the more true it felt. Maybe Dad didn't even want to be a dad, and Paul was a little scared of what Dad might do. Click, clack, click, clack. Paul lifted his head and rubbed his eyes. He must have fallen asleep. He stood up and looked out. The rain had stopped, and the moon bathed everything in a silvery light. Click, clack, click, clack. Paul wondered how his parents never seemed to hear the clackers. Maybe it was a special thing, for his ears only, but he didn't waste much time thinking about it. Very soon he was running across the wet grass to join his brother. Paul's father was in a hurry to get out of the kitchen and was gulping down his breakfast. Even though it was still quite early, he could barely wait to get to the lake. "Charles, I'm worried. He has started sleepwalking. I'm sure of it. Twice now I found the back door unlocked in the morning, even though I know you lock it every night. And this morning I found some muddy footprints." "He's sneaking out at night." It was more of a statement than a question. Charles buttered a piece of toast, scooped egg up on it, and stuffed it all in his mouth. Amy wondered what happened to all those good manners he had had years ago when they were courting. "No, I said sleepwalking. You know that Paul wouldn't wander outside in the dark if he were awake. Paul doesn't like the dark. He isn't bold at all, not like Lenny." She abruptly silenced. Charles had leaned across the table and was clenching her chin between his thumb and fingers, pulling her forwards. "I've told you never to speak of him, or even think about him." He fairly hissed the words. You're hurting me." Amy blinked back tears. He stared at her hard and released her so suddenly that she nearly tumbled back into her chair. "Sorry, but you know even mentioning him upsets you all over again." "You mean upsets you? I don't want to forget Lenny. I can't forget him. I love my son. And why does it upset you so much? Do you feel guilty?" she thought to herself. "You know I'm right. It's for your own good we put his memory and everything about him behind us and move forwards, right?" The way he said right almost sounded like a threat. "Of course, dear, I'm sorry." Wiping his mouth roughly with a napkin, he gulped a last swallow of black coffee, clattered the mug down on the table, and started for the door, as if the past few moments had never happened. "Don't worry, Amy. I'll talk to the boy. If he's sneaking out, I'll teach him a lesson." "Charles, you didn't hear a word I said, did you?" His hand was on the doorknob. "I said," he turned to face her, "lesson, not beating. But I'll tell you straight up, I got plenty of good, solid paddlings when I was growing up, and it made a man out of me. Nobody ever babied me. I make a lot of concessions to you, Amy, to your ideas of child rearing, and you don't even appreciate it. All you do is constantly criticize whatever you think is wrong, but the boy needs to learn actions have consequences." He opened the door and finished talking without looking back at her. "Me and the boys will be out fishing at Pine Lake. Don't wait dinner for me. We'll probably go by the Reel 'em In afterwards." Amy almost sagged with relief as the door closed. Living with Charles had never been easy, but it had become nearly impossible after what happened with Lenny. Her husband had been so unreasonable that day. He didn't even ask their son for his side of the story. Mr. Williams had shown up at the door with that irritating son of his in tow, the kid sporting a heck of a shiner. The big lout was blustering around outside the door in a fury, saying that Lenny hit his Teddy for no reason. As soon as Charles had seen it was his boss at the door, he immediately apologized, repeating several times over how disappointed he was in his son's childish behavior. He promised the man his bad-mannered boy would apologize. That was when the problem started. Her husband had demanded his boy tell the Williamses that he was as sorry as his dad was for what he did. Her world collapsed then. Lenny ran out, pushing past the Williamses. She had called out after him and had even taken a step or two after him. while Charles just stood there, making no attempt to even stop him. Amy closed her eyes against the sights and closed her mind against sounds of the scene playing out in her memory. Torturing yourself won't bring Lenny back, and it won't change anything else either. He's gone, and nothing can change that. It's been 2 years, and it still hurts so much. Is there anything worse that can ever happen to a parent than to lose your child? Nothing had prepared her for this type of pain that ran so deep it left an echo. She squeezed her eyes shut and then blinked them again. Paul was standing in front of her, looking so much like Lenny, it gave her a start. "You okay, Mom?" Paul reached out gently, touching the red marks on her cheek. "What happened?" "Never mind that," Amy forced herself to smile. "Your dad's gone fishing. What do you say to cereal in front of the TV and cartoons?" Paul's face broke into a large grin. "I say yes!" Amy decided that if Charles could take a day to go fishing, then certainly she could take a play day with her son. And that's exactly what she did. She packed them a picnic lunch, and they walked to the woods to go exploring. Paul brought his camera along. Maybe he could get a picture of some deer, or maybe even a bear. Amy smiled and told him there hadn't been a bear sighted in those woods for decades now. "You know, Mom, maybe if there isn't a bear, maybe we'll see Bigfoot." "Bigfoot? Oh my!" Amy felt herself smiling as Paul prattled on. They walked companionably along the woodland path until they came to a clearing where a house had once stood long ago, its stone chimney still pointing skyward like a blackened finger. And if you really looked, there was a faint outline of where a foundation had once been. Amy thought it amazing how nature was reclaiming it as her own. This had been one of their favorite exploring spots. Sometimes they found an old medicine bottle or a button. Once, even most of an ancient-looking doll with its china head still looking nearly perfect. They hadn't been here in the last couple of years. Amy feared it would be painful, but it felt good and right. Happy memories of the three of them, her, Paul, and Lenny, cavorted in her head. At one point, even though she could clearly see that Paul was slightly ahead of her on the path, she could have sworn he was walking next to her, holding her hand. The way it used to be, with either Paul or Lenny taking the lead and the other helping her along the trail. The memory warmed her. "Mom, stand over by the chimney while I take your picture." Amy posed as directed. There was the click and the whir as the gray square was produced. Paul shook it about, and then they both watched as the image developed. Amy frowned a bit. There seemed to be another figure next to her. She didn't think these new Instamatics could take double exposures, yet right next to her seemed to be a rather translucent Paul. Paul half whispered, "Lenny," and realizing he had spoken the forbidden name out loud, clapped both hands over his mouth. He looked at Amy with eyes wide with fright. Amy saw the fear in his eyes and dropped to her knees, pulling him in for a hug. "Oh, baby, it's okay. I'm glad you remember Lenny." She pulled back to look him in the face. "You can talk about him to me whenever you want. I miss him too." She smiled at him, even as she blinked back tears. "God, Charles, what emotional damage did your don't even say his name policy do to our son?" Well, this relieved Paul. It confused him, too. Hadn't his father told him that just mentioning Lenny would hurt Mom? Just not around Dad? That's right, baby. Not around your dad. For For the rest of the afternoon, while they dug in the soft dirt looking for buried treasures with their trowels, and while they ate their picnic lunch, they both remembered Lenny, things he said or did. The only thing they didn't talk about was the accident. That was something neither one wanted to remember, but could not forget.
"Sure is a beaut. You have a birthday or something we don't know about?"
Charles Finley stood on the banks of Pine Lake with the other guys, admiring Mark's new rod and reel.
"No,"
Mark laughed. His broad face split open with a big grin.
"Deb got a raise at work and surprised me with it."
One of the guys clapped Mark on the back.
"Sort of makes up for the bucket of chicken or frozen dinners, don't it?"
"Aw, it ain't that bad, fellas. Weekend, she still cooks actual food."
"Yeah, but is it edible?"
Todd teased while handing out beers.
"What you gonna do when she starts making more than you?"
Caleb joked.
"Why, retire and let her support me,"
Mark kidded back.
"I wouldn't mind sitting around eating bonbons and watching the tube all day."
Charles knew he wasn't the only one who thought they knew what Deb had been doing to get a raise at work. If Mark hadn't heard the gossip that she and her boss were carrying on, then he was the only one.
"That's what you get for not keeping her ass home where it belongs. A woman needs to know her place, and her place is in the home, cooking and cleaning and tending to the needs of her man, and sometimes that man needs to remind her of that. When Amy had that silly notion of even taking a part-time job, I nipped it in the bud. You should have, too."
Charles moved a bit down from the others, planting himself atop a large rock with his feet dangling over the edge. He casted his line out easily and began the game of waiting. The sun was warm on his shoulders, and he felt himself starting to really relax. This is how life should be, where his only responsibility was to keep himself from falling into the water. He was close enough that he could still hear the chatter of his friends to his left, yet far enough that, unless they paid attention, they wouldn't notice that half the time he didn't even bother to bait his hook. Unless they caught something really trophy-worthy, they practiced catch and release, so why waste the bait was his line of thinking. And later, at the reel 'em in, the fish they had caught would have mysteriously grown several inches, and the ones that got away would make a great white look like a guppy. Charles was among the last of the group to leave the reel 'em in. Todd and Mark wanted to get home before their kids went to bed. Funny thing that, Charles thought. Here he was dragging his feet to avoid the kid, and here they wanted to beat the Sandman. He just didn't get it. Caleb wasn't married and was in no hurry to get back to his apartment. They'd have another beer or two before leaving, then part ways in the parking lot.
"You know I could always pick you up when we go fishing. You could leave your car at home."
Caleb said this every fishing trip.
"I know, buddy. Just my way of making sure the missus doesn't go on a shopping spree while I'm gone."
It was more truth than joke. Charles didn't like Amy leaving the house, not without him knowing where she was going or who she'd be with that might fill her head with this women's lib nonsense. Caleb chuckled, even though the joke was not only bad, but stale.
"Okay, boss, you have a good night."
Charles made sure he stayed well within the speed limit on his way home. He was pretty sure if he was stopped by the cops, he'd flunk a breathalyzer test and had no urge to spend the night in the drunk tank. To top it off, it had gone a bit foggy. He hunched over the wheel as the fog intensified, shrouding everything. Was that a dog up ahead, or a bit of brush? He frowned as he drove. At least traffic was almost non-existent, another plus for small-town living. Although it was barely 8 o'clock, it looked and felt much later. Hopefully the boy would at least be in his room, if not asleep, when he got home.
It wasn't like Paul was a bad kid. His mother just babied him too much. If Amy would stop interfering with his authority over him, and if he didn't look so much like the other one. Charles refused to let the thought finish and concentrated on driving instead. He was nearly home, and he felt his shoulder muscles relax a bit. Driving in heavy fog was so stressful. He'd be darn glad when he pulled into the drive. What the... A small figure darted in front of the car, causing Charles to slam on the brakes. Shifting into park, he jumped out, fearing he had struck a child. He ran to the front of the car and looked at the empty pavement. Kneeling down and fighting the taste of bile, he peered underneath. Nothing. He sagged against the bumper, thankful. He had been so certain it had been a child. He looked towards the house, the direction the figure had been heading, but the fog was thick enough you could barely make the house out. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound, accompanied by the child's giggle, floated on the wind. He shook his head. Only one child lived on this stretch of road. He went from grateful to angry in under 30 seconds. Paul, you little bastard. You have been sneaking out, haven't you? When I get my hands on you, you'll get such a whipping you won't sit for a month of Sundays. Charles entered through the back door. After all, Amy had said she'd found it unlocked several times. He was annoyed at finding it locked and fumbled for his keys. He strode through the house and up the stairs. He didn't even notice Amy sitting on the sofa looking at him. Aha! The little bastard was in his bed, feigning sleep. Charles roughly pulled Paul from his bed. You aren't fooling me. He spat the words. Paul was more than a little confused at being jarred awake. His father's vice-like grip felt as if he might just rip the arm off. Even as he wanted to cry out in pain, he managed to squeak, Dad, what's wrong? Don't give me that. You've been sneaking out. Charles shook the boy. Haven't you? What? No, sir. Paul's balance was precarious as he was forced on tiptoes as Charles' grip grew even tighter. Don't you lie to me. With his free hand, Charles was undoing his belt buckle. I'll teach you. His voice had become a growl. You could have gotten yourself killed with that little prank of yours. Then to lie. Paul, Charles, what is going on? Amy's eyes went wide at the sight of the belt dangling from Charles' hand as she entered the room. What are you doing with that? I'm going to teach Paul a lesson about lying. I saw him out there. I nearly hit him with the car. Amy stepped between them, pushing Charles' hand off the boy's arm. She was a bit alarmed by the way his eyes flared, both in surprise and anger. She was clearly undermining his authority, as he saw it. He had never hit her before, but she felt he was close to doing so, something that had happened more and more often. You couldn't have seen Paul outside. He's been asleep for the past hour, and I've been downstairs watching TV. He couldn't leave without me seeing or hearing him. Charles was doubtful. Perhaps she was lying to cover for the brat. But then, he had never caught her in a lie before. Damn it, Amy, I know what I saw. Maybe the fog was playing tricks. Maybe you should go lie down. She could feel her bladder wanting to release, and her heart was pounding so hard, surely he could hear it. My God, I really am afraid of him. The thought hit her. Until this moment, she hadn't thought she was actually afraid he might hurt her or the kids. Not really, not on purpose. But now she realized it was true. She was scared of Charles. Maybe. Charles grumbled and left the room, shaking his head in disbelief. Okay, well, maybe I have had a few too many beers, and maybe what I thought was a kid was a trick of the fog, but what about that sound? He frowned. Maybe that was some wind chime. Sound can travel quite a distance.
Maybe it was a wind chime and its sound was warped by the trees and shit. Maybe. Charles rubbed his chin. No, I'm not buying it, he thought. He shook his head in frustration. It just didn't make sense. He'd go to bed and pretend nothing had happened at all. Maybe it was just his inebriated brain playing games. Charles slept fitfully. In his dream, he was lost in dense fog, chasing a giggling shadow. The entire time, an ominous tattoo of click, clack, click, clack could be heard. In the odd way dreams have, he went from groping his way through the fog to driving in it. He was trying to escape the fog and that infernal sound. Suddenly, a small figure ran out in front of him, and there was a thud. Paul lay on the road, his small body broken. Charles went down on his knees. Someone was saying, "Don't move him, help's on the way." But he already knew that the boy was beyond help. He stared down at the small face. Wait, this wasn't Paul. It was the other one. Out of sight, he heard Amy screaming Lenny's name. Then Lenny's eyes opened and stared at him. They were cold and hateful. Why, Dad? Why did you do this? Do what? He hadn't done anything. It had been a tragic accident. Everyone had said so. No one had even hinted that his reflexes, and having been varsity track in both high school and college, he could have easily caught the boy before he ever got to the road. But he didn't. He hadn't even tried. But that didn't mean it wasn't just a very unfortunate accident. Charles jarred himself awake. His mouth was dry, and his heart was racing. He stared around the room. He shook his head. He wasn't feeling so great. Not exactly sick feeling, but not great. As he left his bed, he noticed Amy wasn't there. On his way to the bathroom, he peeked into Paul's room. There was Amy, curled protectively around her son in his small twin bed. Charles fought the urge to drag her from the bed. She didn't belong there. She only belonged in his bed and no other. It seemed to go this way often. Whenever he wanted or needed her, she was with the brat, coddling him, turning him into some kind of sissy that would never be able to stand up for himself. Sighing heavily, Charles decided this time he'd let it go. The next morning, Paul escaped outside right after breakfast. Amy thought that was a smart move. He might be able to avoid Charles for a bit that way. She wished she could do the same. Instead, she sat nibbling at her thumbnail while her coffee sat untouched, debating on whether or not to wake Charles and ask if he wanted breakfast. Maybe the best tactic would be to wait for him to come down and then offer. That would delay having to face him. She hated this anxious feeling, as if she was somehow in trouble or had done something wrong. Dread, that was the word she wanted. She dreaded seeing Charles, having to interact with him, knowing it could go badly if she said just one word wrong. She heard Charles's heavy tread on the stairs and had his coffee poured by the time he plopped down on a kitchen chair. Her query about making him breakfast met only with a grunt and head shaking. He looked poorly. Maybe he was getting sick. She almost felt bad for him, but just as quickly thought it was probably just a hangover. Long ago she figured fishing was just a euphemism for drinking. Silently she prayed he hadn't noticed that she hadn't come to their bed last night. That would mean explaining, and she feared it would set him off. The truth was, she had been terrified that Paul would sleepwalk that night, and that Charles would catch him and see it as proof that he had been right, that it had been Paul out in the fog. Amy knew without any doubt that it hadn't been, but she wasn't sure she could stop him from doling out his brand of discipline again. Every time she thought of how he looked with that belt, her stomach tightened. She stole a look at Charles with his head bent over his mug. "Who are you?
You aren't the man I thought I married. Some sound had woken her. Amy lay still, listening. She frowned and got up to check on Paul. Peeking around his bedroom door, she saw his bed was vacant. She hustled herself down the stairs looking for him. She didn't call out, as if she expected he was sleepwalking. She didn't call out if, as she expected, he was sleepwalking. She didn't want to startle him, and she didn't want to alert Charles either. Instead, she acted on a hunch and went to the back door. It wasn't locked. She knew it had been. Opening it in the dim moonlight, she could just see him climbing up to the treehouse. Given the circumstances, she did the only thing she could think of. She followed him. Looking up from the base of the tree, she thought she heard Paul talking to someone, and she thought she heard a familiar voice answer back. Perhaps Paul and another friend had snuck out to meet up on their idea of a grand adventure. She sighed and wondered if she was more relieved that he wasn't sleepwalking or more perturbed that he was sneaking out. What if something happened? No one would know until possibly much later. He could get hurt or something worse. Awful little nightmare scenarios that only a parent understands danced across her mind in an instant. In that same instant, she had come to a decision. Whatever the case was, she'd handle it on her own, without Charles and his lessons. Although jeans would have been better suited to climbing than her long nightgown, Amy still managed to climb the boards nailed up the side of the tree that served as a ladder to the platform and poke her head up, peering through the doorway. She was surprised to see Paul, all by his lonesome, talking to himself. She had been sure she had heard another voice, but obviously she was mistaken. Apparently Paul had an imaginary friend. Suddenly, he turned his head towards her. "Hi, Mom. Come on in." His face was beaming as if something wonderful was happening. Amy hauled herself the rest of the way up and then sat cross-legged on the floor across from Paul. "What are you doing, Paul?" Paul seemed confused, looking first at her, then turning his head back around and giving a shrug as if at someone. Amy stared into the dark corner but saw nothing. "Oh, have you someone with you?" Paul giggled. "Sure I do, Mom. Can't you see him?" "Well, it is a bit dark." Just then she saw the clackers lying next to him. Her mouth went dry. "Where did you get those?" She nodded, pointing at them, her hand shaking slightly. "They looked exactly like Lenny's." Paul picked them up. "I didn't get them. They're Lenny's. He brought them with." She looked puzzled. "You really can't see him, Mom?" He looked down at the clackers in his hand, then slowly raised his head back up. "I'm right here, Mom. It's me. Aren't you glad to see me?" Amy felt confused. She knew she had buried the clackers with Lenny, yet here they were. She stared at Paul and knew this wasn't Paul, not her Paul. There was something different, but it couldn't be. Lenny? She half sobbed the name and then found herself reaching for him, even as the thought that this was completely impossible and something was desperately wrong with Paul punched her brain. He was in her lap in a flash, nestled against her chest, and she clutched him tightly, rocking and crying, half wanting to believe, half scared of what was happening to her child. She closed her eyes, breathing in his scent. Oh, God, he even smells like Lenny. "Oh, Mom, I missed you so much. I kept trying to let you know I was here. Have you missed me?" Lenny, Paul, pulled away slightly.
and Amy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, looking at him. More than you could ever know. Not a day or a night goes by that I don't miss you. I've always loved you so much. More than chocolate? Lenny asked, and it was like cold water on her face. Paul never said that. He was never able to pronounce it right. It was chocolate when he tried. Besides, he didn't even like the stuff, preferring vanilla. She nodded. More than chocolate. More than Paul? He grinned, teasing her with a bit of sibling rivalry. No, you and Paul are my heart and soul. I love you both the same. Well, at least I beat out chocolate. You love that a lot. Yes, I do. So I must love you both lots. With that, the warning voice in her head that was shouting that this was wrong and she shouldn't indulge this delusion went quiet. But still she needed to know. Is Paul still here? Yes. I'm just using him for a bit. It doesn't hurt, but he'll be tired after I leave. Leave? Amy's arms tightened a bit around him. He'd only just got here. Again, her inner voice tried to warn her that this was impossible, and she shouldn't mess with things she didn't understand. Maybe she should check them both into a hospital. Well, not leave. Just leave his body. I'll never leave you, Mom. I'm always with you. But staying in Paul too long isn't a good idea. It's just, I needed you to know that I really am here. You're not imagining things, and Paul isn't crazy. That was you in the woods that day. In the picture, too? Yes. I tried so hard to let you see me, like Paul can, but I think you need to believe that you can see me. Grown-ups have a harder time. That's why Paul said I could use him. You needed to know that I'm real, that I'm here, not just in your dreams. A small cry rose in Amy's throat as she held her boy close. She didn't understand the how or why. Logic said one thing, but her heart said another. She decided it didn't matter. All that did matter in this moment was the overwhelming love she felt, and she knew without a doubt she'd do anything for her boys. Amy woke and almost convinced herself that it had all been a very vivid dream, but she couldn't explain how the soles of her feet had gotten so dirty, or the smudge down the front of her gown. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had happened, and yet, to believe it would be lunacy. The dead don't come back. That night, after Charles was deep asleep, she slipped from their bed across the hall and sat in Paul's room, the room he had once shared with Lenny. She sat and looked at her son, wondering. At first she thought perhaps she was the one who sleepwalked. Perhaps the night before was some sort of mental breakdown. She knew she wasn't done grieving Lenny's loss, although after 2 months, Charles had practically ordered her to be done with it. No speaking his name, no talking about past events that centered on him, no mementos, or anything that might remind them that there had even been a son. It was as if Charles had erased him from their lives, but he couldn't expunge Lenny from her heart, her memory. Perhaps that was skewing her sleeping actions and thoughts, the fact she had to keep these things to herself. And if it was having that effect on her, an adult, what could it be doing to a child like Paul? Click, clack, click, clack. The sound grabbed her attention. Click, clack, click, clack. Paul sat up, rubbing his eyes, and didn't seem surprised to see her sitting there at all. Instead, he took her by the hand, signaling for her to be quiet, and led her out to the treehouse where Lenny was waiting. This became nearly a nightly event, unless the weather was bad. Lenny hardly ever took over Paul anymore. Instead, the three of them would laugh and play like they used to. Amy found she could not only hear Lenny, but she could now see him as she accepted that he really was there. Perhaps she was only fooling herself, or maybe she'd gone crazy, she thought. But believing it was so eased her hurt, and how could that be bad? Weeks passed, and the trees turned colors. Soon it would be too cold to go to the treehouse very often. The thought saddened Amy, now that she had Lenny back. She didn't want to go any length of time without seeing him. Fact was, she spent nearly all her free time up in the treehouse now, just to be near him. It seemed he wasn't restricted to just the night, and often she'd go during the day, with Paul in school and Charles at work, and spend time with him. They'd talk of how things used to be, and Lenny would tell her how things could be like that again, even better if they just got rid of Charles. Amy knew it was true. They'd never really be happy as long as Charles was in the picture, scared that they might displease him in some way, afraid that he might become violent. And he would never, ever accept that Lenny had returned. Instead, he might even try to have them committed. Amy thought about divorcing Charles, but divorces were granted for only 3 reasons: adultery, extreme cruelty, or desertion for 2 years. And Charles did not meet the criteria on any of the reasons. So, like it or not, unless she and Paul left, they were stuck with Charles. Of course, she could leave him, just take Paul and leave, although Charles wouldn't stand for that. He'd just follow. And how would she support them? She recalled when she had wanted to get a part-time job, how Charles had pointed out that she had no sellable skills that would get her a job that paid anything at all. And if it was their future she was worried about, well, if anything did happen to him, the life insurance was enough to take care of her and the boys quite nicely. She really didn't see divorce as an option. For all intents and purposes, she and Paul were stuck. Then one day, Lenny said, "I'm running out of time, Mom. Soon they won't let me come here anymore. I don't want to not be with you and Paul again." It was like a dagger to her heart. Lose Lenny again? No, she couldn't have that. She'd do anything, to keep both her boys. Click, clack, click, clack. What is that sound? Charles pulled his face up out of his plate long enough to look around. What sound? I don't hear anything, Amy said. Click, clack, click, clack. That sound, Charles snapped. I don't hear anything either, sir. Paul quickly took a drink of milk to keep from laughing as Charles paused to glare at him, then continued walking around the room looking for the source. Click, clack, click, clack. It came from over by the window. Click, clack, click, clack. No, it sounded more like it was by the sink. Click, clack, click, clack. He was fairly certain it came from outside. Finally, he said, I don't have time for this, and went to work. It resumed after he came home. Click, clack, click, clack, as he tried to eat his dinner. Click, clack, click, clack, while he tried to watch TV. Then silence for a bit, until he was trying to go to sleep. Then it was click, clack, click, clack, most of the night. The onslaught was repeated the next day and the next. Amy asked him what the sound was like. You know, that stupid toy the boy used to have. What did we call it? Clackers. That's it. It sounds like some damn kid playing with one of those. Oh, you mean like Lenny had? Paul piped up.
Angry fists came down on the table. "I told you never to say his name." Charles exploded. With one stride, Amy was next to Paul, ready to defend him physically if need be. "Why not, Charles? Why aren't we allowed to say his name or talk about him? Did you hate him that much? Do you feel that guilty?" Charles' eyes bulged and his face turned nearly purple with rage. It was only through great effort he turned and stormed off to bed. Click, clack, click, clack. Lack of sleep was taking its toll. Not even the liquor he drank stifled the noise. Click, clack, click, clack. It had been over 3 weeks now. He had to find out what was making it and stop it. Click, clack, click, clack. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. He got up roughly and made his way down, not trying to be quiet, not caring if he woke the others. Click, clack, click, clack. He was going to put an end to things. Click, clack, click, clack. He followed the sound out the back door. Click, clack, click, clack. He looked at the treehouse and thought, "I've got you now, you son of a bitch," as he began his ascent upwards. Click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. The sound was louder and faster as he reached the doorway. In the shadows, he thought he saw Paul, the 2 glowing globes of the clacker arcing up, hitting, then falling down and striking again. Click, clack, click, clack. "Paul!" He spat the word, lunging in through the door, thinking he'd teach this brat a lesson he'd never forget. The clacker stopped. "Not Paul. Look again. Look closer. Don't you recognize me, Father?" The voice was icily calm and took Charles aback. "Why don't you call me by my name?" Charles stared in disbelief. "No, it can't be," he stammered. "Lenny is dead." "Finally you say my name, so you do remember me." With a slight flick of the wrist, click, clack, click, clack, the globes were sent in motion again. Click, clack, click, clack. "Stop that!" Charles made a grab for the toy, but Lenny swung them, forcing him back. "You killed me! You know you did!" Click, clack, click, clack. With each clack, Lenny took a step forwards, and Charles retreated a step. He remembered how hard those balls were, and with a bit of power behind them, they could injure. He recalled that's why they were taken off the market. Click, clack, click, clack. "It was an accident. Everyone says so." Charles's voice cracked a bit as fear stole over him, along with the certainty that this was not Paul. Click, clack, click, clack. He took another step back toward the opening. "You killed me. Admit it." "All you had to do is say you're sorry. Would that have been so hard? Instead, you acted like a child." "I was a child. Paul's a child. Of course we act like kids. And when did you ever say you were sorry? Not once. Not once when Mom cried for me. Not once when Paul said he missed me. Not once to me for being a coward and not standing up to your boss, or for trying to make everyone forget me." Click, clack, click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. The globes picked up speed, and suddenly they were sailing, perfect missiles catching Charles on the side of the head, sending him reeling back and down. It wasn't a terribly long fall, but far enough. It was an accident. Everyone said so.